This footage we have of Meadows taking an unusual trip to Georgia. This was after Trump lost, December 2020. What you see here on this still shot is Meadows was trying to ambush a ballot counting center. He was blocked from entering. You can see here him standing outside the closed doors. Meadows also tracking down and conferring with Georgia's elections investigator, who then got a call from Trump.
Mark asked me to do it. He thinks you're great.
Now, Meadows was leading those brazen efforts. And then in private, he was working with Trump to still try to steal the Georgia race. And, you know, they knew they had an uphill battle. Even if they had broken the law and succeeded in election fraud and reversing Georgia's outcome, they would have needed to do that again in 2 other states. So this is desperate, brazen stuff. I'm going to show you in a moment how badly it went and how Meadows knew it went badly, because soon enough he'd be burning documents and seeking pardons. So keep that in mind when you hear him joining Trump's call with that top Georgia elections official and weighing in.
The president mentioned Fulton County, but in some of these areas where there seems to be a difference of where the facts seem to lead. And so, Mr. Secretary, I was hopeful that, you know, in a spirit of cooperation and compromises, there's something that we can at least have a discussion to look at some of these allegations.
Always be wary when someone trying to overthrow and end our democracy and start an authoritarian dictatorship talks about compromise. Again, we have to be clear with our words and our facts at times like these. That was January 2021. Everyone was preparing for the peaceful transfer of power, including the military. All challenges had been exhausted. The courts had said no to those. They have the right to go to court. They lost. And so in January 2021, with the race over and the winner called and everyone getting ready for inauguration, that's what Mark Meadows was still doing. And that's more than being a switchboard. He was trying to steal the race. And the facts, as we've shown you when we've tracked them, show a series of plots running over time. They include, in these red arrows, the ultimate violence of January 6th, but they also go beyond it with those other plots, the state level, the elective fraud. And Meadows was present or participating in more than one of those plots. He was a key leader of the effort, as the New York Times put it. And while Meadows ducked testifying before the Jan 6 committee, remember who we heard from. Remember, its star witness was the star only because she worked for Meadows every day, only because she had the access and the detail of so much of what he did. And in some ways, the committee saw her, a cooperating witness under oath, is more reliable at the time than him, someone going through every single step to duck telling the truth. Now, in fairness, his lawyer now says he's telling the whole truth to Jack Smith. We'll see. But that's why Cassidy Hutchinson was a star witness. Indeed, there are reports that Jack Smith's probe intensified after hearing so much from this Mark Meadows aide.
Is it your understanding that President Trump asked Mark Meadows to speak with Roger Stone and General Flynn on January 5th?
Mr. Meadows did complete both a call to Mr. Stone and General Flynn the evening of the 5th. Mr. Meadows had a conversation with me where he wanted me to work with Secret Service on a movement from the White House to the Bullard Hotel so he could attend the meeting or meetings with Mr. Giuliani and his associates in the war room. He didn't look up from his phone and said something to the effect of, things might get real, real bad on January 6th.
Things might get real bad. They did. When the violence broke out and a lawyer, Pat Cipollone, rushed into Mark Meadows' office trying to get the president to stop the ongoing attacks, the horror of what you see on your screen, which was scarier at the time because they didn't know how many murders it would end with, or whether politicians would be assassinated, or whether Mike Pence would be stomped into great damage, injury, or death. They didn't know. I say that quite seriously. We have to remember how that felt in the moment. That's what prosecutors do. They piece back together the horror and the facts. And what might have been a sort of patriotic movie about an attack turned into a story of an inside job. Hutchinson gave this chilling account that is so relevant now with the heat on Donald Trump, because her account was about one person's culpability in that room in addition to Trump. Her account and I'm emphasizing this for a reason tonight, was that Mark Meadows was not surprised, was not taken aback, was not rushing around going, oh my God, there's a violent insurrection. Her account under oath was that Mark Meadows already knew that he and Trump would not be acting to defend the Capitol or defend the police or defend the members of Congress in both parties or defend Vice President Pence, who at the time was under what the Secret Service viewed as mortal danger. What she testified was that Mark Meadows knew this was the outcome they wanted. And so as these probes intensify, we should all think about that. Her account was not that there was a kind of fog of war, a fog of insurrection, or confusion. Do they really want to kill Pence? Are they really being violent? Her account was that this was the execution of a premeditated, clear plan to breach the Capitol. And if it worked, her account was that Mark Meadows was the one saying, and I'm going to show it to you again, Mark Meadows was the one saying, you heard Trump, he thinks this is right, he thinks Mike Pence, quoting the testimony, deserves the outcome, including this effort at assassinating him. Again, we know more now than we did before. All of this has come into clearer view, and here is that testimony.
And I remember Pat saying to him something to the effect of, the rioters have gotten to the Capitol, Mark. We need to go down and see the president now. And Mark looked up at him and said, he doesn't want to do anything, Pat. I remember Pat saying something to the effect of, Mark, we need to do something more. They're literally calling for the vice president to be effing hung. And Mark had responded something to the effect of, you heard him, Pat. He thinks Mike deserves it. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong.
So they have operational entry into the Capitol. They're talking about murdering Mike Pence. And this witness under oath says, Mark Meadows says, yup, yes, you heard him. He deserves it. Pence going along with what he says was Donald Trump's intent, which was to have or to allow the assassination of Mike Pence. The words sound almost shocking, extreme, or radical, even all these years past what originally occurred and what we watched in those committee hearings. That's why I began this report tonight by saying some of this might seem old. Why are we still talking about it? And much of it is still right here in the zone of whether there will be accountability. As for Meadows saying he doesn't think there's anything wrong with it, the wording is striking. Meadows discussing whether people were doing anything wrong. Because the evidence shows Mark Meadows, who we just learned went in to testify, was worried that he did something wrong, burning documents after a meeting with a congressman in his office, according to that same aide. That is real Watergate-level stuff. Mark Meadows worried that others would determine that he did something wrong. Again, if it sounds bad, I'm talking about the facts and the witnesses around Meadows. I'm not adding any extra speculation or thought. We know Mark Meadows, according to his closest daily aide, thought they'd get the goods on him, thought they'd know he committed crimes, that someday a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor, maybe a prosecutor like Jack Smith, could come along and indict him on federal charges. And Meadows, clinging to the power that they hadn't managed to hold on to through a coup, knew there is only one way that he could actually stop that. And that would be to try to get, even amidst all of that heat and controversy, to try to get on the way out the door a federal pardon. And that's exactly what Mark Meadows tried to get.
Did White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows ever indicate that he was interested in receiving a presidential pardon related to January 6th?
Mr. Meadows did seek that pardon. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. And she, that witness, put her word and liability on the line. She is testifying under oath. He was running and ducking. Her testimony has been deemed fairly credible, although, again, we will always report denials in other contexts if we get it. But when Meadows' aide says Meadows burned documents and sought a pardon, that is his state of mind. Pardons are for criminals. Now, Mark Meadows did not get that pardon. Perhaps one more hard lesson in working for Trump, who has shown he cares more about offloading whatever he's done. He cares more about that than he cares about the people that he offloads to. Now, what's Mark Meadows thinking? Well, we don't know. I can't tell you that. But you think about what he lived through, what he did, the evidence he burned, the pardon he sought. Mark Meadows may have been thinking about all of this just about every day since the original January 6th. He may have thought about what he knows he did and what he thinks prosecutors will figure out about what he did. So again, as I mentioned, in one sense, it was a long time ago. And people need to move on, and the country has to do its business. But in another sense, this is not past. It is prologue to some of the most consequential decisions to come. About whether perhaps there's still not enough evidence and you wrap up and drop these cases. Prosecutors sometimes do that. Or whether Jack Smith, the DOJ, and Attorney General Garland, who have the final supervisory call, whether they will treat people who recently ran our government as literal enemies of the state, as defendants in cases about stealing national security secrets or espionage, or even as the leaders of coups attempted to end our democracy. The stakes really couldn't be much higher.